The grand marble lobby of the Tokyo International Summit gleamed under the crisp morning light. Polished floors reflected the movement of world leaders, CEOs, and high-powered executives weaving through with practiced elegance. Among them, Thomas Wexler, an American tech billionaire, stepped out of his limousine, flanked by assistants and security. Dressed in a tailored gray suit and signature sunglasses, he exuded wealth, influence, and control. Today was supposed to be routine. A major partnership deal with Japanese investors was on the agenda, one he'd been preparing for months. But as he strode toward the conference wing, a small, unnoticed detail began to crack that perfect image: his translator wasn't there. He glanced down at his phone, checking the time. Still no messages. No calls. His assistant stammered something about traffic. "She'll be here any minute," he muttered, trying to sound confident. But Thomas's brow was already furrowing. He didn't speak a word of Japanese. And this wasn't just a casual conversation. This was a billion-dollar agreement, set to solidify his company's foothold in Asia. The glass doors slid open as he entered the conference room. Around the long oak table sat 10 Japanese executives in sleek suits, greeting him politely in their language. He smiled, bowed shallowly, trying to mimic what he'd seen others do, and sat down at the head of the table. Cameras clicked. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Then the introductions began, rapid, formal Japanese that meant nothing to him. Words flew around the table like a current he couldn't swim against. He nodded, forcing a polite smile, his heart starting to pound behind his ribs. He checked his phone again. Still nothing. Where was she? The lead executive leaned forward and handed him a document. Everyone paused, waiting for his reply. He scanned the page. All Japanese. He blinked, frozen. He looked up at the table, 10 sets of eyes watching him. Expecting him to speak, to lead. His palms began to sweat. He laughed nervously, tapped the document, and said, "Great, yes, very promising." A few executives exchanged puzzled glances. The silence thickened. He was completely alone, locked in a room of high-stakes negotiations with no bridge between languages. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt powerless. The room settled into an awkward stillness as the Japanese executives turned to one another, exchanging quiet words he couldn't understand. Thomas forced another tight smile, nodding like everything was fine, but inside, his mind was spiraling. The lead investor, Mr. Nakamura, leaned forward and gestured toward the document again, speaking slowly, respectfully, but entirely in Japanese. There was no malice in his tone, only confusion. Still, every word struck Thomas like static noise. He glanced again toward the door, hoping, pleading, for his translator to walk through it. But the door remained closed. His assistant stood by the wall, equally helpless, her eyes wide with panic. She didn't speak Japanese either. No one on his team did. That was the translator's job. And now she was gone. He took a deep breath, trying to summon his years of corporate confidence, the voice that had won over investors from Silicon Valley to Singapore. But confidence couldn't compensate for ignorance, not here. Not now. He looked back at Mr. Nakamura and gestured vaguely to the paper. "Maybe we can revisit some of the terms in English," he said, half hopeful, half desperate. No one responded. The words didn't land. The table remained silent. Some of the younger executives looked unsure, while the elder ones remained composed, hiding their disappointment behind polite expressions. Then one man, seated near the middle, pulled out a small translator device. From his pocket, he pressed a button and began to speak. The robotic voice that echoed after was clunky and incomplete. "You, change something, no understand deal, please explain." Thomas felt a pit open in his stomach. This wasn't just a language barrier, it was a breakdown of trust, clarity, and professionalism. The translator wasn't just a convenience, she was the lifeline that was supposed to prevent this exact disaster. He tried again. "This partnership means a great deal to us. We want to build something long-term, innovative." His words hung in the air, unanswered. Only more blank looks followed. Suddenly, the stakes became terrifyingly real. If this deal fell apart, it wouldn't just be a missed opportunity, it would signal instability to the international markets, maybe even damage his company's stock value. Not to mention his reputation. The tech mogul who couldn't manage a basic meeting. He gripped the arms of his chair, forcing himself to stay still as the murmurs resumed across the table. He caught fragments of words, his name, his company's name, but nothing made sense. The room felt smaller now. The air thicker. Sweat collected at his temples, despite the cool blast of air conditioning. Thomas Wexler, billionaire, innovator, public icon, was unraveling before 10 calm, collected men who were deciding, in real time, whether he was still worth their trust. He tapped the table lightly, trying not to show the panic building in his chest. But it was already too late. They could see it, and they weren't impressed. The paper sat in front of him like a loaded weapon. Every eye in the room locked on him, waiting. The pressure mounted with each passing second. Thomas picked up the document again, pretending to read it, as if he could decipher even one character of the tightly packed Japanese text. He nodded slowly, drawing out time, silently willing someone, anyone, to step in and rescue him from the growing disaster. He looked up, clearing his throat, and gestured vaguely with the paper. "Yes, this looks acceptable," he said, trying to sound assured. But the words came out weak, hesitant, empty. One of the executives, a man seated closest to Mr. Nakamura, raised a brow and responded in Japanese. His voice was calm but direct, and he pointed to a specific line on the page. The tone wasn't aggressive, but it was clear he was asking a question, something specific, maybe even a clarification of terms. Thomas's stomach turned. He had no idea what had just been asked. He hesitated, smiled, tilted his head as if he were thoughtfully considering a complex issue. "We may need to adjust that slightly," he said vaguely. "Depending on implementation timelines." He tapped his pen twice on the table, a nervous tick he hadn't used in years. Silence. Then a quiet ripple of conversation flowed between the Japanese executives. Short, clipped exchanges, polite yet unmistakably puzzled. A younger man near the end of the table leaned toward a colleague, whispered something, then glanced quickly at Thomas with a hint of doubt. Another checked his watch. He could feel it, the shift in the room. What had started as a respectful engagement was transforming into a diplomatic mess. His vague answers, the confusion, the absent translator, it all painted a picture he didn't want to be in. He didn't look strong. He didn't look prepared. He looked like a man floundering, wearing a suit that suddenly didn't fit. Desperate, he pulled out his phone under the table and typed a frantic message to his assistant. "Where the hell is Maya? I need her now." No reply. He looked back up just in time to see Mr. Nakamura gently fold his hands and speak again, more slowly this time, clearly aware of the awkwardness that had taken root. The tone wasn't angry, but it was formal, maybe even cautious. Thomas could guess what it meant. Something was wrong. The deal, or at least their confidence in it, was slipping. Feeling the walls close in, he made one last attempt. "Look, I think there's been some miscommunication," he said, gesturing to his chest. "Our translator was delayed. If we could just..." But no one understood. No one translated. The words went nowhere. He stopped speaking, his mouth still slightly open. The moment stretched, heavy and humiliating. His hands rested on the table, clenched tightly around the pen, knuckles white. The silence was no longer polite. It was tense. And in that silence, he felt it, something he hadn't experienced in years. Not just frustration. Not even fear. It was powerlessness. Complete and undeniable. The silence hung in the air like fog, thick and unrelenting. Thomas shifted in his seat, trying to mask the sweat gathering at his hairline, but he could feel his shirt beginning to cling to his back. The quiet wasn't just awkward now, it was charged. Around him, the executives began to lower their eyes, some pretending to read their notes, others quietly folding their hands. No one interrupted, but the message was clear. They were waiting, and they were growing tired of waiting. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He pulled it out instantly, hoping it was Maya, his translator, with some explanation, any lifeline at all. But it was only a calendar notification, useless and tone-deaf in the moment. He locked the screen without reading the rest and set it down, the clang of metal on wood louder than he intended. He took a breath, trying to center himself. For years, he'd prided himself on being the man with the answers, the one who could walk into any boardroom in any country and command attention with confidence. But here, in this room, without a single thread of language to cling to, he felt exposed. Not because he couldn't speak Japanese, but because everything he was, every piece of power he carried, depended on the illusion that he was always in control. Now, He was nothing more than a well-dressed man nodding at conversations he didn't understand. And the others knew it. Mr. Nakamura exchanged a look with another senior executive, then politely slid the contract back across the table toward Thomas. His expression remained neutral, but Thomas didn't miss the subtle message: we cannot continue like this. One of the younger men leaned in, speaking softly to Nakamura, who nodded slowly. Then, in a clear and surprisingly fluent voice, the young man turned to Thomas and said, "Perhaps, we should reschedule. When communication is more effective." The words hit Thomas like a slap. Polite, yes. Respectful, sure. But the undertone was unmistakable: we're wasting time. He felt heat rise in his face, not from embarrassment, but from frustration. He wanted to explain that this was a fluke, that his team was usually seamless, that the missing translator didn't reflect his company's reliability. But how do you argue that when the proof of failure is literally happening in real time? He stood up slowly, trying to regain a sense of authority. "I understand," he said. Completely. Even though everything in him screamed not to walk away, he knew pushing forward would only damage things further. "We'll reschedule. With proper preparation." Nakamura nodded once, and the executives began quietly packing up their papers. The mood in the room softened just slightly, not out of forgiveness but relief. The disaster was over. For now. Thomas turned and walked out of the room, his pace steady, but inside he was unraveling. His assistant rushed to meet him in the hallway, her face pale. "Still no word from Maya," she said breathlessly. Thomas didn't answer. He kept walking, jaw clenched. He didn't need Maya anymore, he needed a miracle. As the heavy doors to the conference room swung shut behind Thomas, the polished hallway outside offered little comfort. The clack of his expensive shoes echoed sharply against the marble, and his assistant struggled to keep pace. Everything he had built, every calculated step that led him to this international summit, now felt as if it was unraveling. His thoughts raced, not just about the failed meeting, but about how it would be perceived. The headlines, the investor calls, the whispers among competitors. A titan of industry, undone by a missing translator. He reached the corridor leading toward the private lounge, but something caught his attention. A small movement at the far end of the hall, barely noticeable. A woman in blue coveralls was pushing a mop bucket, her head low, earphones peeking out from beneath a loosely tied headscarf. She was humming softly, unaware of the storm unraveling just meters from where she stood. The janitor. Thomas might have walked right past her, but something about her pace was different. As he neared, he noticed her glance up, not at him, but toward the closed doors of the conference room. Her brow furrowed slightly. Then, to his surprise, she pulled out one of her earbuds. Her posture shifted, attentive. Listening. She stepped slowly closer to the meeting room entrance, not intrusively, but with clear curiosity. Thomas, now stopped a few feet away, narrowed his eyes. Something about her presence wasn't random. Her eyes flicked to him briefly, then back to the door. Then she spoke, softly but clearly. They were trying to clarify Clause 4.2, the product licensing terms. Thomas blinked. "Excuse me." The janitor turned to face him fully now. "Clause 4.2, she said again. They wanted you to explain the exclusivity window, how long your company intended to keep distribution rights locked to your platform." He stared at her, stunned. "You understood them?" She nodded slowly. "Yes. I grew up speaking Japanese. My mother's from Kyoto. I worked as a translator for 5 years before things changed. Now I clean floors." It hit him like a tidal wave. In that moment, while his translator was lost in traffic, while his assistant panicked, while millions were slipping away, this woman had been quietly mopping the hallway, understanding everything. She wasn't just bilingual, she understood the business language too. Licensing, exclusivity, distribution rights. She wasn't just a janitor. Thomas took a cautious step closer, lowering his voice. "Could you translate? If I brought them back in, would you be able to help?" Her expression was hesitant, eyes flicking down to her uniform. I suppose I could try." "You're more than qualified to try," he said quickly. "You may have just saved this deal." She looked at him for a long moment, gauging his sincerity. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Then let's fix this," she said quietly. For the first time that day, Thomas felt the tide begin to turn. Thomas led the woman, still in her janitor's uniform, down the hall with an urgency that surprised even himself. Just moments ago, he had felt like a man drowning in a room full of silence, but now, with this unexpected ally at his side, he could feel the tide beginning to shift. He didn't even know her name yet, but somehow that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had understood. She had been there, listening, when no one else could help. As they approached the double doors of the conference room again, Thomas slowed his pace. His assistant caught up behind them, confused. "Sir, what are we doing?" "We're going back in," he said firmly. "With her?" Thomas didn't answer. He looked at the janitor beside him. She stood quietly, smoothing the front of her uniform, suddenly aware of how out of place she might seem. But there was a calm confidence in her eyes, subtle but unmistakable. She was ready. Thomas gave her a slight nod, and she returned it. He stepped back into the room. The executives were still inside, gathering their things. Some looked up in surprise. Mr. Nakamura raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The young man who'd spoken earlier turned toward Thomas, unsure of what to expect. "I apologize for the earlier confusion," Thomas said, motioning to the woman behind him. "This is Aiko. She's fluent in both English and Japanese and understands the nature of our business. She's kindly agreed to help clarify a few things, if that's acceptable to you." There was a pause, a moment suspended in uncertainty. The Japanese executives exchanged brief, silent glances. Mr. Nakamura studied the woman for a second longer than the rest. Then he gave a single, respectful nod. "Please," he said in English, gesturing for her to speak. Aiko stepped forward. Her voice was steady as she introduced herself in fluent Japanese, explaining her background, her understanding of the conversation, and her willingness to mediate. As soon as she spoke, the shift in the room was palpable. Shoulders relaxed, eyes softened. Trust, once strained to the breaking point, began to rebuild. She turned to Thomas and translated Mr. Nakamura's earlier question, the one about Clause 4.2. It had been a simple request for clarification, not a challenge. Something easily answered, had someone only been able to understand. Thomas responded, carefully, clearly, and she translated back. A small but meaningful exchange. The conversation picked up from there, halting at first, but growing smoother with each passing moment. The executives, once hesitant, began re-engaging. Questions were asked, answers returned. Aiko moved effortlessly between languages, her presence blending formality with humility. She didn't try to dominate the room, she simply made it whole again. And somehow, in doing so, she reminded everyone there that understanding is the real currency in any deal. Thomas sat a little straighter now. His confidence, shaken but not shattered, began to reassemble. He glanced over at Aiko once, catching her eye. No words passed between them, but the gratitude in his expression was clear. The meeting was back on. And this time, it was real. The energy in the room had transformed. What had started as a quiet unraveling of a high-stakes deal was now rebuilding itself with measured grace and cautious optimism. Aiko stood calmly between the two parties, her voice fluid as she moved between English and Japanese, translating not just words but intentions. Tone, respect, nuance. Everything Thomas's original translator, though competent, had always done mechanically, Aiko now did with something deeper, an instinct, an emotional intelligence that couldn't be taught in school or bought with money. As each point was discussed and clarified, the tension that had weighed so heavily on the room slowly melted. The executives, who had once been seconds from walking away, now leaned in again, curious and engaged. One even cracked a faint smile at a light-hearted remark Thomas made, a comment that, had it been lost in translation, might have only deepened the awkwardness earlier. But Aiko delivered it with perfect timing and subtle warmth, eliciting a soft chuckle across the table. For the first time all day, the room felt human again. Mr. Nakamura, who had remained composed and guarded for most of the meeting, asked a particularly intricate question about joint market strategies and long-term localization plans. Aiko listened intently, translated the query to Thomas with remarkable clarity, then turned back to deliver his response with the same precision. No detail was left out. No tone was flattened. She had become more than a translator, she was a bridge. Thomas watched her closely, more impressed by the minute. This woman, who minutes ago had been pushing a mop in a hallway no one cared to glance down, now held the attention of a room full of decision-makers who oversaw hundreds of millions in assets. It wasn't just the words she translated, it was the credibility she restored. He caught the slight shift in posture from Nakamura, the way he sat back, contemplative, stroking his chin. A good sign. When the conversation reached the part of the proposal where Thomas had earlier floundered, licensing windows, exclusivity clauses, Aiko took the initiative to elaborate gently on the Japanese side, ensuring everyone was aligned on the subtle implications. Thomas saw a few heads nod. One executive even leaned toward her to ask a clarifying question directly, bypassing Thomas entirely for a moment. And Aiko didn't falter. She answered, then turned to Thomas with a quick summary, including the tone and reasoning behind it. It was then that he realized something else. She wasn't just saving the meeting, she was elevating it. Toward the end, Mr. Nakamura folded his hands on the table and gave a thoughtful nod. He spoke slowly, formally, and with respect. Aiko translated, Mr. Wexler, we appreciate your transparency today. And your flexibility. These qualities matter to us. Thomas returned the nod. We're committed to making this partnership not just profitable, but lasting. Aiko delivered that line in Japanese, and Thomas could see the message landed. A final exchange followed, a request for revisions to be sent that evening, a confirmation of next steps, and with that, the meeting drew to a close. As they stood to shake hands, Nakamura did something unexpected. He turned to Aiko and offered a slight bow, a gesture of genuine acknowledgement. Then he turned to Thomas. We look forward to working together, he said in English. Thomas smiled, firm and proud, but it wasn't his words that had saved the day. It was hers. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft whisper behind them, muting the hum of voices and the distant footsteps from the now dispersed conference. Thomas stood in silence beside Aiko as the lift descended, the soft glow of the overhead lights casting a pale reflection in the mirrored walls. He held his leather portfolio loosely in one hand, the other tucked into the pocket of his navy blue suit, but his thoughts were far from the sterile confines of the elevator. He turned toward her slightly, taking in the sight of her, the same woman he'd passed countless times in hallways, invisible in the way society so often made people like her. And yet here she was, the linchpin in a multi-million-dollar agreement, the person who had salvaged his reputation and perhaps even the future of his company. Still wearing her janitor's uniform, still holding the same mop handle she'd left leaning in the corner, Aiko stood with quiet composure, her eyes forward, hands clasped lightly before her. You could have let me fall, Thomas said, breaking the silence, his voice softer now. You didn't have to step in. She gave a small shrug, almost sheepish. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. I knew what they were saying. And I knew you didn't. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh but tinged with disbelief. You didn't just help me, Aiko. You completely turned the meeting around. They respected you. Hell, they trusted you more than me, and I don't blame them. She didn't respond at first. The numbers above the door ticked downward. Then she said, I used to do this kind of work. Not for people like you, exactly. But I loved it. I lost the job when my mother got sick. Had to take care of her. Full-time. When she passed, I didn't have much left. So I cleaned. Her tone was matter of fact, not bitter. Not proud either. Just, truth. Thomas's jaw tightened. He wasn't often speechless, but there was something about her humility that left him feeling disarmed. Humbled. He thought of all the consultants he'd hired, all the polished candidates with perfect resumes, all the executives who'd never worked a hard day in their life. And here was Aiko, unseen, undervalued, underestimated, until today. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors opened to the marble lobby of the high-rise. Natural light poured in through the floor-to-ceiling glass, catching in Aiko's eyes as she stepped forward. Aiko, he said quickly before she could walk away. She turned back. I want to offer you something. Not as a favor. Not out of pity. Because you've earned it. He paused. Would you consider working with me again? Officially. As a translator. Or, honestly, something more. We need people like you. People who actually understand people. Aiko's eyes searched his for a moment. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't closed off either. Finally, she asked, would I still be seen? You'd be heard, he said. She nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on her face. Then maybe it's time. They stood there in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by wealth and movement and status symbols. But for a brief moment, it wasn't about any of that. It was about two people, one who thought he knew how the world worked, and another who had been forced to see it from a much different angle, meeting in the middle. And maybe, just maybe, beginning again.